Okay, class, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 6, which is going over the nervous system. So we're finally in Module 4 of the class. We have about a week left of the class. I know everybody's about done with Module 3, and hopefully everything has been going well so far. A couple of things that I want you to be familiar with as you go into Module 4. Keep in mind that at the end of the week, you will have your final exam, which is your clinical case study. All other assignments that we've been doing thus far are the same. You'll have 2 quizzes, a discussion board, and then the only difference is that final exam. Quiz number 7 is going to be on Chapter 6, and quiz number 8 is going to be on Chapter 7. There are 2 parts to Chapter 6, but I'm only going to go over part number 1. That's all you're going to be responsible for on quiz number 7 is the material that I go over here. The second part is very short, and it's just a couple of specialized issues, so we're only going to go over part 1. All right, so with the nervous system, as always, there are some word roots that I want you to be familiar with. The main thing with the nervous system that can potentially be challenging is obviously distinguishing between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But the central nervous system has the brain and the spinal cord, and obviously the brain can get extremely complex. There's multiple components to it. With this PowerPoint, the main things that I want you to appreciate is obviously some of the anatomical features of the brain. It doesn't go into a ton of depth, but I want you to know what each major portion of the brain is responsible for. So, for example, the medulla oblongata is responsible for respiration. The cerebrum has several motor components to it. The midbrain and the Brocae area, that's responsible for skeletal muscle functioning. I want you to be able to take a portion of the central nervous system and be able to attribute it to its primary function. Also, I've changed my background. I thought that would be a little bit fun for everybody. So in any case, make sure that you know those. And then the peripheral nervous system has more of the neuron anatomy that you need to be familiar with, the dendrites, axons, the myelin, etc. So just have an appreciation for those things as we go. So here are your big word roots. Don't really need to go over them. These are just a matter of memorization. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, the nervous system has 2 major divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, simply put, is the brain and the spinal cord. That's all there is to it. Those are your big central components, and really everything passes through the brain or the spinal cord. Those are our major centers for both efferent feedback and afferent feedback. That's our control center. That's where all of the major neurological decisions are made. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. This is where we have our big receptor feedback, meaning that if I need to sense something in my external environment or even my internal environment, the peripheral nervous system is going to pick that up. It's going to send that feedback to the central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system carries the effect away from the brain. It's going to give the desired outcome. So the classic example is if I were to touch a hot surface, if I were to touch a stovetop, my peripheral nervous system is going to pick up that I'm touching a hot surface. And then when I rapidly pull my hand away because I'm touching something hot, the receptors in the peripheral nervous system picked up the hot sensation. That information went to the brain. The brain signaled a response and probably a portion of the spinal cord. It's going to send effector feedback or afferent feedback through the peripheral nervous system back to my hand. My bicep is going to contract in order to pull my hand away. That whole series of actions is nervous system functioning. The nervous system, simply put, is a big communication method for the body. We have 2 primary communication systems in the body, the endocrine system and the nervous system. What does the nervous system do? Like I just said, we have receptor feedback and an effector response. How is it doing that communication? It's depolarization and a nervous system impulse that travels to the brain, and then we can get the desired outcome. So know that the major pieces of the nervous system is the brain, spinal cord, and of course the nerves themselves. And what's the primary function of the nervous system? Communication. There's a couple of others: motor control, sensations, senses, etc. But the main thing is a communication method. So we have our two big functional divisions. We have either sensory input or we have motor output. Sensory input is our afferent division. Afferent input is that receptor feedback. Afferent means that it's traveling toward the brain and we're delivering some kind of message to the brain or the spinal cord, depending on what's happening in the external environment. That's our afferent sensory division. And then we have the motor division, which is the effector response or the efferent feedback. Efferent feedback is going away from the brain, and that means it's carrying the response necessary depending on what the initial input is. So simply put, the two main divisions, the two main functional divisions is afferent and efferent. Afferent is going toward the central nervous system. Efferent is going away from the central nervous system. The efferent nervous system can get broken down into two more divisions. We have the somatic efferent division and we have the autonomic efferent division. Simply put, the difference between the two, somatic versus autonomic: somatic is voluntary control and autonomic is involuntary control. So whatever the outcome is, whatever the effector response is in that efferent division, if it is voluntarily occurring, then you know it was somatic. If it was involuntarily occurring, then you know it was autonomic, right? So an example of an autonomic response, I have no control over it, would be like my heart rate. My heart rate increasing in rate or decreasing in rate, I have really no voluntary control over that. That's an autonomic response. A somatic response would be like contracting my bicep or contracting my deltoid. I have control over that, and therefore it's considered somatic. Okay. I really enjoy this breakdown of the nervous system. It gives you the two major divisions, but then it further breaks it down. I'm not going to go over each one individually. It would take a while, but what we've gone over thus far is the two pieces to the peripheral nervous system. We have afferent versus efferent, incoming versus outgoing. We can break down the efferent division into somatic versus autonomic, and then we can further break down the autonomic into parasympathetic versus sympathetic, and that's differentiating depending on the neurotransmitter that's being produced, whether it be epinephrine, norepinephrine, or cortisol. Whatever the case may be, it gets broken down even further. And simply put, sympathetic is considered excitatory and parasympathetic is considered inhibitory. In any case, those are autonomic responses. Once again, if my heart rate goes up, that is efferent, autonomic, and that would be sympathetic because my heart rate is being stimulated to increase. If my heart rate goes down, that would be efferent, autonomic, parasympathetic because it's inhibiting heart rate. It's relaxing. It's a depressant, right? And then if we go over to the central nervous system side, two main divisions, of course, brain and spinal cord. That can be broken down much further into the different components of the brain versus the different components of the spinal cord. What you'll notice is the spinal cord simply is the spinal cord. There are some complexities to the spinal cord, but in terms of divisions and pieces or whatever, the spinal cord, simply put, the higher it goes, everything below it is what's affected. So what's interesting is with spinal cord injuries, if I were to injure my spinal cord because I was in a car accident or something, the higher up the injury is on my spinal cord, everything below it is what's effective because it's kind of this descending cascade. So if I sever a portion of the spinal cord up at my C5 vertebrae right at the bottom of my neck, then I'm going to be paralyzed from the neck down. If I get injured at the L5, like a portion of my spinal cord, the spinal cord stops at L1. If I injure a portion of the spinal cord at the L1, my lower back, then I'm going to be paralyzed from the waist down, so my legs will be paralyzed. So the spinal cord is just broken up based on the level of the spinal cord, and then it controls really everything below it and also the lateral portions of it, right? But the brain has, of course, many complexities. Do you need to be an expert on the brain for this PowerPoint? Of course not. But just have an appreciation of all your major divisions, the cerebrum versus the diencephalon, which is just the posterior portion of the midbrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum, and all of the subdivisions. They all have very big functions that allow for nervous system functioning. Okay. But before we go into the brain, have an appreciation for a neuron. The big pieces of a neuron are the cell, the dendrites, the axon, and the myelin sheath. Each one of these things have their own respective functions, but this is the picture that you need to know from an anatomical standpoint. The dendrites up here are what's receiving the incoming stimuli. It's receiving the incoming impulse. So if a neuron is communicating with another neuron, for example, the initial impulse is going to come in through the dendrites. The dendrites will then carry that sensory information. It will be processed in the nucleus or the cell body right here in the center. It has mitochondria. There is some metabolic features to a neuron and so forth. But the cell body is going to take that impulse, and a depolarization wave is going to travel down the axon right here. And then it gets to the synaptic knob, which is just the end of the axon. And then that polarization can travel out of the neuron and it can hit the target cell. Now, surrounding the axon is the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is just a fancy way to say the insulation to the axon. We have to maintain that impulse. We have to keep it nice and insulated so we don't lose any as it travels down the axon. And that is our myelin, right? That's all of this surrounding layer right here. The little junctures in between each myelin sheath, those are known as the nodes of Ranvier, which is just where there is no myelin sheath, the start of one and the end of another. That is your node of Ranvier. And the entirety of the myelin sheath, the whole body of the myelin sheath, that is your Schwann cell. That is the nucleic layer. It's not the nucleus, but it's a big functional layer of the peripheral system neuron that allows for its functioning. So be familiar with all of those anatomical features of a neuron. And neurons have three different classifications. There's multipolar, unipolar, and bipolar. And the way that you know the difference between the three, of course, there's a definition on the screen, but the way that you know the difference between the three types of peripheral system neurons are depending on its cell body location or the nucleus location. If it is, let me go down to this picture, it's easier. If the cell body is within the dendrites, if it is kind of centralized among the dendrites, then it's known as multipolar. And it's multipolar because it's taking in the cell body, the nucleus is taking in multiple polarization waves. It's able to maintain multiple impulses, right? If it's bipolar, then that means the cell body is a little bit ascended or descended rather from the dendrite. It's still considered a part of the dendrites, but it's a little bit displaced from it. And if it's unipolar, then that means the nucleus or the cell body is actually an extension of the axon, right? Meaning that it can really only carry one polarization wave at a time. And it's not that one is bad over the other. It's just they are within different regions of the nervous system. They play different functions, and just have an appreciation of where the cell body is. And then you can distinguish between the three. Okay, now we have neuroglia. Neuroglia cells are, there's a big component of it within the central nervous system, kind of composed of multiple portions of the brain, but there's multiple different types of neuroglia which are aiding in neuron functioning, right? And the four type of neuroglial cells that are assisting a portion of the central nervous system and sometimes the peripheral nervous system are the oligodendrocytes, the epidermal cells, the astrocytes, and the microglia. Okay. The main one here that you really got to appreciate are those oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are that myelin functional unit of a central nervous system neuron. A peripheral nervous system neuron has a myelin sheath unit that's called the Schwann cell. The myelin of a peripheral nervous system neuron is a Schwann cell. The myelin of a central nervous system neuron is an oligodendrocyte. Okay, you got to know the difference. It gets confusing because you're like, well, Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, I thought they were like the same thing. It's dependent on what type of neuron that it's aiding. Oligodendrocytes, central nervous system myelin. Schwann cells, peripheral nervous system myelin. Got to know the difference there, but we know what the function of myelin sheaths are. It's to insulate the polarization wave that travels down the axon. Then we have ependymal cells. Those simply produce cerebrospinal fluid within the central nervous system. That's in that epidural space where the majority of the fluid is being produced. We have the astrocytes that forms the blood-brain barrier. And then finally, the microglia cells are an extension of the immune system. It's the immunonervous system, and that is simply carrying an immunoresponse through the neurons associated with the immune system, microglia cells. All right, and here's all of it put together. Of course, you're not going to have to like look at this image and identify what's what, but just know neuroglia cells, they are assisting a portion of the central nervous system. They're assisting a neuron that's trying to do something in the central nervous system. The big one is the oligodendrocyte. Okay. Then we have the neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system. And like I just said, we have the Schwann cell. The Schwann cell is also the myelin sheath, but this is the myelin sheath of the peripheral system neurons, like we just said. And the only other one that you have to know are the satellite cells. Okay. These control the chemical, mechanical, and baro-internal environment for the peripheral nervous system. So the satellite cells are just kind of, acting as a communication method for the central nervous system. So for example, skeletal muscle has satellite cells within it, and satellite cells are neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system, and satellite cells are going to initiate and signal for upregulation of protein synthesis, for example. So satellite cells are responding to and managing the internal environment of whatever portion of the peripheral nervous system. So those are really the only two pieces there. Just again, have an appreciation for that. Okay. Now we're getting down to the ever so dreaded central nervous system and portions of the brain and the spinal cord. We'll start off with the brain. The brain has multiple layers to it, right? And it has three fibrous layers. The three fibrous layers that you need to be familiar with are the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. And it goes from outside to inside. The dura mater is the tough-ish external layer of the brain. The arachnoid matter is the middle portion, the middle fibrous layer of the brain. And then the pia mater is that internal portion, right? So the dura mater and really all of the fibrous membranes to the brain, they're just acting as protective layering. Okay, they are acting as, kind of an insulation point, and they're really just creating that housing layer for the brain. And also we have that epidural space that allows for fluid transmission and maintaining hydrostatic pressure. These fibrous layers are not just protective layers, but there has to be some hydrostatic pressure and some fluid pressure maintained in the brain. How do we maintain that hydrostatic pressure? Well, we have to have an epidural space that allows for some, a little bit of fluid retention, right? And that therefore maintains the hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. The arachnoid space, the middle layer, and then you can further divide it into the subarachnoid space. And this is where we have passage of cerebrospinal fluid. And we'll talk more about cerebrospinal fluid here in a minute. Okay. And then finally, we have the pia mater, internal portion of those fibrous layers. And this is where we have all of the blood vessels of the brain that are allowing for oxygen delivery to the brain and other nutrients, etc. And that's the main function of the pia mater. Yes, a little bit more of a layer of protection, but primarily where all of our big blood vessels are. Okay, so here's everything put together, just multiple layers, and just have an appreciation for what each thing does. Once again, dura mater is going to be our first line of protection. Arachnoid mater is where we're going to get our first little layer of epidermal space and hydrostatic pressure. And then the pia mater is where we have all of our blood vessels. Okay. And then jumping right into the meninges. The meninges are an extension of the spinal cord, right? And the meninges are broken down into multiple layers as well. Obviously, the same as the layers of the brain. We have dura mater of the meninges, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Exact same thing, but now we've traveled down to the fibrous connective tissue of the spinal cord. Okay, so as you can see from the picture, we have the spinal cord passage through the vertebrae. Okay, and then we have the dura mater, outermost layer, arachnoid mater, which is this whitish layer, and then this purplish layer, that is our pia mater, and then we're finally down to the spinal cord itself. Okay, so now that we are, in the discussion of the spinal cord and a portion of the brain, let's talk about the cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain contains 4 interconnecting ventricles, okay? And the ventricles are simply cavities that hold cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, they allow for passage of cerebrospinal fluid. It travels down the spinal cord, and where is all this cerebrospinal fluid being produced and being housed? By the interconnecting ventricles of the midbrain. Okay, where is cerebrospinal fluid produced? It's produced by the choroid plexuses. Okay, and those are obviously within the ventricles. Okay, so that's where we have all of our cerebrospinal fluid. There's 4 total ventricles, 2 lateral wings, a 3rd ventricle that travels down, and then a 4th ventricle that travels down a little bit further, all the way down to the brainstem. So here's what it looks like all together. It makes the most sense if you look at it from an underneath view. The ventricles, all you need to know is that's where we have all of our cerebrospinal fluid production. Okay, the big components of the ventricles: 2 lateral ventricles, these little horn-like extensions right here. The 3rd ventricle is just traveling right down the center hemisphere. And then the 4th ventricle is right underneath the pons and right up against the brainstem. That's where we have our connection to the spinal cord. Whoops. All right, so the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, once it's produced and once it's being excreted from the ventricles, the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle to the 4th to the central canal or the subarachnoid space. So like I said, that arachnoid space is where we maintain some of our hydrostatic pressure and where we have some of that cerebrospinal fluid. We have flow of the cerebrospinal fluid all the way to the subarachnoid space. So we're not on the level of the pia mater, but we do have it flow down, and from that subarachnoid space upwards around the brain or down the posterior side of the spinal cord, then up the anterior side. So basically what this is all saying is it goes from lateral to third to fourth through, this whole time we're in the subarachnoid space, right? Once we get down to the brainstem, we can either go up the posterior sides of the brain, or we can go down the descending portion and then back up the ascending portion of the cerebrospinal, or the spinal cord rather. That's the general flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Nothing super complex there, but it really saturates every portion of the arachnoid space, all the way around the brain and all the way down the spinal cord. Okay. Eventually, cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed in the dural sinus within the dura mater, and secretion and absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid is at equal rates to keep a constant hydrostatic pressure. So the rate of absorption and reabsorption versus no absorption, all of that is just dependent on diffusion pressures. If there is low pressure, then absorption goes down, and if the pressure is high, then the production goes down, et cetera, right? But it's all in an effort to create a constant hydrostatic pressure, okay? Now, cerebrospinal fluid serves a couple of functions here. The primary functions are listed: provides buoyancy, right? That's essentially saying the floor of the cranial cavity is the bone with various ridges. The cerebrospinal fluid allows the brain to float in the cranial cavity. Basically, you don't want the brain like touching anything. You want it to not come into contact with the bony floor of the skull, right? You don't want it in contact with anything, right? So if we have a layer of cerebrospinal fluid, if we move the head abruptly, if we hip the head, it's suspended in fluid, and that in a way keeps it buoyant. There's a little bit of movement there without damage, and it inevitably helps protect it as well. Carries some sugar as well. Cerebrospinal fluid does. So it allows for nutrient transfer, and it also maintains chemical stability, removing excess hydrogen ions. Okay. All right. Now let's go on to the brain itself. The brain has multiple portions to it. We have the cerebrum, which can be divided into left and right hemispheres. And what's the most identifiable trait of the brain? It has ridges and it has wrinkles, etc. Those ridges and wrinkles have names. Those are the gyri and the sulci. Gyra and sulci. Okay. The gyra are the folds themselves, and the sulci are the indentations, the center portion of the fold, if you will. Those are critically important traits of the brain. There's the argument that the more folds there are, the more opportunity for neural transmission there is, and therefore the greater the cognition. The smoother the brain is, the less cognition that takes place, etc. Right? So we need those gyrus and we need those sulci in order to maintain optimal neural transmission. Obviously, know all of the big directional terms associated with the brain. We have the hemispheres of the cerebrum, the left and right hemisphere. The frontal lobe is in the anterior portion. The occipital lobe is in the posterior portion. Parietal is the center. And then temporal, obviously on the temporal side of the head. So those are all just simply directional terms. We'll get to cerebellum, brainstem, and spinal cord. This is just pointing out the big directional pieces of the brain, and then a few more big components. The cerebellum is the big protrusion down at the bottom, and then the brainstem is simply the portion that just before you extend into the spinal cord. Okay. All right. Now, if we were to look into the brain, what would we see? Well, there's a lot going on here. Obviously, there's the ventricles that we just talked about that hold the cerebral spinal fluid, but let's get down to the diencephalon. The diencephalon is this midbrain portion right here. Okay, so diencephalon. The diencephalon is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, right? And that is the posterior portion of the midbrain. This little circular region right here, that is our midbrain, okay? This little oyster looking shape right here, that is our corpus callosum, and that houses the majority of our midbrain. The diencephalon is where we have our thalamus and our hypothalamus, and that's right here on the posterior portion, right? And then the brainstem itself can be cut into 3 further divisions. The brainstem does a lot of things. A quick point right here, the lower we go in the brain, the more primitive the responses are. So, for example, the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, these are things responsible for like our fight and flight responses. The medulla oblongata is responsible for respiration. It's responsible for heart rate, right? These are very primitive, essential, things to our being, right? But the higher up we go, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, right? All of these things up here, that's where we get our more complex thoughts. That's where we get our motivations, our wills, our sensory perceptions, our orientations. That's where our limbic system is. So just keep that in mind as well. But do have an appreciation for this slide. Be able to identify the corpus callosum and then work your way out from there. Okay, so starting off with the cerebrum has numerous folds and shallow grooves, argyra and sulci, right, like we just explained. And the left and right cerebral hemispheres, that's that big division in the brain. The left and right hemispheres actually do completely different things. There's the theory that the left portion of the brain is the mathematical side and the right portion of the brain is the emotional reasoning side. Right. So that, some people think that some people are more left brained and some people are more right brained. I don't know how true that is, but the cerebral hemispheres are responsible for different things. They don't do exactly the same thing. And they're divided by the big longitudinal fissure. And the only thing, the main thing holding them together is the corpus callosum that we just went over. That's that big centralized encasing of the midbrain, right? And it's holding together our 2 hemispheres. Okay. The cerebrum is composed of the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex has an outer portion and an inner portion, of course. The outer portion is the gray matter, and the inner portion is the white matter. What are the difference between gray matter and white matter of the cerebral cortex? Simply put, gray matter are unmyelinated fibers, and white matter are myelinated fibers, and therefore it's contributing to the general color of it, right? So the gray matter is where we have neuronal cell bodies that are mostly acting through glial functioning. And the white matter is where we have a lot of our executive functioning, a lot of impulse transmission, and a number of other things, right? But those are the main difference between the two. Gray matter is unmyelinated, white matter is myelinated. Okay. And then we already talked about this. These are mostly, they all do different things, of course. And I think we'll talk about the functioning here in a moment. But these are mostly directional terms. Frontal lobe, anterior occipital lobe, posterior parietal lobe is in the center, and temporal is on the temple side, right? And then the insula, that is going to be, relatively close to the midbrain, right? So just keep in mind that those are mostly directional terms, right? What's the overall functioning of our cerebrum? Well, They do a number of things. And like I said, we're at the top of the brain. We're all the way at our big executive functioning, right? At our big bulky portion that is the cerebrum. What are we doing way up there at the top of the brain? This is where we get, specific characteristics about self, personality traits. When it says will, that's referring to like our motivation systems. Like, what are we motivated to do? Not necessarily just the will to live, but the will to do anything, like the will to get up, the will to do your homework, the will to make this video, the will to succeed, just the will to do anything. Most intellectual processes, voluntary motor responses, walking from point A to point B, these are our big sensory responses, and it actually can get even more complex. This is where we have a lot of our psychological functioning, etc. I'm not going to even attempt to go into that, but hopefully you're just having an appreciation that this is where we get some of our more complex brain functioning. Okay. The frontal lobe is where we have our big motor areas. Motor areas, of course, are referring to locomotion and movement and some of our big efferent responses. The main one that I want you to know is Broca's area, and this is where we get skeletal muscle contraction and functioning. This is where we get, a lot of that efferent drive that signals for skeletal muscle contraction. We're getting the crossover effect from descending motor fibers. All of that is passing through Broca's area. So at a bare minimum, know that one. Okay. And here's everything put together. I'm not going to try to go through it. It's kind of a dense slide, but this is just giving you an appreciation for all the big regions of the cerebral cortex and what each small region does. Where is Broca's area? It's right here, this yellow center portion, and that's going to get skeletal muscle contraction on the opposing side. Okay. Read through all of these functions of the cerebral cortex. It can get pretty interesting. Another thing that I want you to appreciate is this is where we get a lot of our senses from. Smell, taste, vision, touch, etc. All of that goes through the cerebral cortex. Okay. Parietal lobe. This is where we get some of our higher level reasoning and our discernment. So parietal lobe, like I said, we're at the very top of the brain. We're going to get very complex cognition up there. This is where we get our discernment from. If I'm trying to predict the outcome of my actions and reason through a decision, it goes through the parietal lobe, generally speaking. The temporal lobe is where we have one of our big critical senses, which is hearing. This is also Wernicke's area. This is giving us the capacity for language. The temporal lobe is actually big. My brief reading about the temporal lobe is this is where we get our, not just language, but this is where we get our dialect. This is where we get our vernacular, the words we choose, the way that we present words. All of that goes through the temporal lobe, which makes sense because also associated with hearing. So there's just kind of an input-output going on there. But in any case, temporal lobe is where we have Wernicke's area, and that's where we speak and we hear. Occipital lobe is vision, and the insula is not much is known about the function or this portion of the lobe. I haven't read much into the insula. But if they're saying it's relatively unknown, then of course don't worry about it. All right, so let's continue to work our way down. Now let's go into the diencephalon, which is the back of the midbrain. Okay, like I said, this is where we have our hippocampus, hypothalamus, right, and also the amygdala. And this is where we have our limbic system. The limbic system, I know I've mentioned our psychological functioning here briefly. This is where the majority of that happens, though. This is where our emotions are manufactured. emotional behaviors and also our memory. And limbic system, the limbic system is a big time response system. So, for example, if I got bit by a spider at one point and it was very painful, then the limbic system is going to help me create an emotional behavior and an emotional response out of that. So I had that experience, and now every time I see a spider, I get a fearful sensation. I get a fearful response. So now when I see a spider, I might scream, I might freak out, I might walk away, run away, whatever. That's going through the limbic system. Emotional behaviors, emotional decisions, memory, and the emotional response. All of that, all of those complex psychological pathways, that's occurring in the diencephalon, which is where my limbic system is. That's where the hippocampus is, and that's where my amygdala is. Okay. The amygdala is relatively low, and this is where we get our primitive, more primitive emotions, such as, fear, fright, sadness, anger, aggression, and I guess maybe happiness. Again, I'm not super well versed here. All I know about the amygdala is that these are somewhat fight or flight types of emotions. And then when we work our way up, more complex emotions, we get, a little bit higher up toward the cerebellum and the cerebrum and so forth. All right. So I don't want to get too much out of my depth, but again, here's each portion of the limbic system. Amygdala and hippocampus are really the only ones you got to know there. All right. The diencephalon ultimately is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus acts as a switching station for incoming sensory messengers, right? So like we've talked about, we have afferent, which is coming in, efferent, which is going out. The thalamus is one of our transition points. It's something that allows for an efferent output. It's going to initiate a response, and then there's going to be a downward cascade, and then eventually we're going to have some type of motor output. That's what happens at the thalamus. And then finally, the hypothalamus, it actually does the exact same thing, but it's strictly the thermostat. It is our thermal control. Hot versus cold, regulation of homeostasis in that regard, right? And I actually take that back. It's a little bit more than temperature, but the hypothalamus is almost always called our thermostat, right? We get some type of sensory input. It travels through the thalamus or the hypothalamus, and then we get some type of motor output in order to get the necessary response to the sensory input. All of that's happening at the back of the midbrain. Okay. Just talked about the thalamus, just talked about the hypothalamus. The big one is temperature regulation, but also keep in mind it's homeostasis on a number of levels. Even our food and water intake, it's responsible for production of some of our appetite hormones, such as ghrelin, right? If we need to eat more, then there's going to be some appetite there, blood sugar fluctuation, all kinds of things, right? So it's maintaining homeostasis across multiple organ systems. And again, just I would refer to it as our thermostat, okay? And maybe it's not a great example because it's not strictly temperature control, but that is one thing it does. And what does a thermostat do? If it's cold, the thermostat's going to turn on the heat. If it's hot, the thermostat's going to turn on the cold. That's what the hypothalamus does. All right, now we're down to the brainstem. The brainstem is composed of the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain, and the reticular foramina, or the reticular formation. It's usually called the foramina. But in any case, let's talk about each portion of the brainstem. The medulla oblongata does a couple of things. The medulla oblongata, we're all the way down at the bottom of the brain. So what are some of our more primitive necessary things for survival. Well, our heart's got to beat, we got to breathe, our blood vessels need to dilate, we need to maintain pressure of the blood, right? And that's what the medulla oblongata does. The main thing there is it's really helping our respiration rate, and the medulla oblongata, even as I'm speaking right now, my respiration rate is being disrupted. The medulla oblongata is trying to help kind of maintain that, taking breaths when is needed, etc. Right? And there's also our emetic center, which is our gag reflexes and vomiting. Did I eat something that I shouldn't have? And now it's going to kind of initiate the vomiting response. Okay. So here's everything put together. The brain stem, a lot of protrusions going on here. The medulla oblongata is right here in the center that we've just talked about. Here is our pyramidal tract, right? And that's it. That's the main thing that you need to appreciate here. Where is the medulla oblongata in relationship to everything else? It's almost directly beneath the pituitary gland. Don't worry about the optical tracts. Here's our pituitary gland. If we go directly below it, right as we're about to approach the spinal cord, that's where the medulla oblongata is. Okay. Then if we go down a little bit further, then we have the pons, which is a large bulge on the anterior surface of the brainstem, and this serves as a bridge for the motor tracts of the cerebellum. Okay. I guess that's all they want you to know about the pons. The pons kind of does the same thing as the medulla oblongata. That's where we get some of our respiration from, right? And then we have the midbrain, which is where we have our four primary bulges of the midbrain. We're kind of going up and down here, but the midbrain, the four bulges of the midbrain are known as the colliculi, okay? And those are mostly on the posterior surface. The caniculi are broken into anterior and posterior pieces. We have two anterior caniculi and we have two posterior caniculi. Okay, and simply put, the two anterior portions or superior portions, depending on where you look at it, those are going to give us our visual reflexes. Okay, and then our two posterior portions or inferior portions, once again, depending on where you're looking at it, those are going to give us our auditory reflexes, right? And the key thing there is it's a reflex. It's not the one giving us the sense itself. It is giving us a reflex to that sense. So important distinction there. Okay. And then finally, if we get down to the reticular formation, these are just simply groups of cell bodies that are assisting a portion of the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. Okay. They're scattered all throughout the brainstem, and they are just simply assisting in the functioning of the brainstem. And these are associated with arousal and also with our sleep cycle. So if we have downregulated reticular foramina functioning, then that will signal the production of sleep, right? And if we need to wake up from sleep and there's cortisol production and we need to come out of that state, then there's going to be upregulation of reticular formation. We're going to be in an aroused state. So like I said, we're all the way down toward the brainstem. So think of it a little bit more primitively. If we need to run away from a bear, then we're going to be in a very aroused fighting type of state or flight type of state, right? If we need to go to sleep because it's dark outside, then it's going to downregulate, right? So these are our big components of arousal and also sleeping as well. Okay. Next, when we get to the cerebellum is the big posterior protrusion on the other side of the brainstem. Okay. And this is the second largest brain region, very large portion of the brain. Okay. And this is inferior to the occipital lobe and temporal lobes and posterior to the pons and medulla oblongata. So we were just on one side of the brainstem. Now we're on the other side, and the two primary hemispheres of the cerebellum are known as the vermis. Okay, or I'm sorry, the dividing layer is called the vermis. Okay, so we have the connection point that gives us our two hemispheres. Okay, and then once again, just like we were talking about with the other portions of the brain, the outer portion is known as the gray matter. The inner portion is known as the white matter, and the white matter of the cerebellum in this case has a specific name, and this is called the arbor vitae. Okay. All right. The cerebellum, and the arbor vitae is where the majority of the cerebellum functioning is. That's where our myelinated neurons are. So just keep that in mind. What does the cerebellum do? The cerebellum is where we're going to get a lot of our motor reflexes. Okay. Not auditory reflexes, not visual reflexes. These are more so our motor reflexes. So skeletal muscle coordination, balance, posture, equilibrium, and just general reflexes depending on motor sensory input. All of that, the majority of that is going to pass through our cerebellum. So for example, if I needed to hold like a drink in my hand, and the cap was off, and let's say that it's really full. This isn't a good example, but if you had like a cup of coffee that's super full and I want to try to prevent it from spilling over the sides, what's going to happen is on a moment-to-moment basis, my hand is getting motor feedback on what's happening with the liquid in the cup. And I am trying to adjust the motor functioning and the coordination and the balance and the et cetera of my hand in order to prevent the liquid from spilling out of the cup. That constant motor sensory feedback is all going through the cerebellum in order to maintain coordination and the appropriate skeletal muscle response so that I don't spill. That all can kind of be summarized as reflexive memory, and that's what the cerebellum does. So obviously, a point of special interest for us as exercise scientists, posture, coordination, those are all, important traits of human movement. So where do we get that? Cerebellum, and where does a lot of that functioning happen? Where is all of our myelinated sheaths at? That's going to be the white matter of the cerebellum, also known as the arbor vitae. All right, and then finally, there's actually not a whole lot to the spinal cord. The main things you need to be able to identify is where the spinal cord starts and ends, and just some of the external protrusions of the spinal cord. I think there's only a handful of slides here. So just know the spinal cord stops at the foramen magnum, which is, basically right at the top of the C1, right at the axis, right? And then it goes all the way down to the L1, okay? It does not go down to the L5 or even the S1 or any of that. It stops at the L1, okay? The cauda equina extends from the inferior end of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord has gray matter in the form of an H and white matter arranged in columns. So there are white matter and gray matters to the spinal cord as well, okay? And the spinal cord descends from the medulla oblongata through the foramen magnum. Okay, so we've extended out of the brainstem, and it passes through our vertebral bodies, or the vertebral canal. So obviously the vertebrae, it's housing our spinal cord. We're traveling all the way down to the L1, right? And only spinal nerves occupy lower levels of the vertebral canal, making up the cauda equina. Okay, so what this is essentially saying is really at the bottom, there's nothing innervating those lower vertebral columns other than the spinal cord. There's no other innervations from other nervous system bodies. That whole component of the spinal cord, that's our cauda equina. And simply put, the lower portion of the spinal cord is the cauda equina. Okay. All right. So like I said, with the spinal cord, I think what you're going to be tested on is being able to identify the different regions of it. So remember, all of our terms still apply in terms of the layers of the nervous system and the gray matter versus the white matter. Okay. Even with the spinal cord, we still have dura matter, outer portion, outer fibrous layer, arachnoid matter, which is the middle portion, and we have the pia matter, which is the internal portion, which is where we have some blood vessel innervation. Okay. We have epidural space, which allows for cerebrospinal fluid to flow. Okay. And the only other thing that we haven't covered is these extensions right here are simply called spinal nerve rootlets. Okay. We have the spinal cord itself, but it branches off out of the sides, and those are simply called rootlets. Okay. Those are the only things there that you want to be familiar with. Okay. The gray matter of the spinal cord can be further broken down. Okay. It can be broken down into the central canal, the anterior horns, the posterior horns, and it's mostly composed of interneurons. Okay. And the white matter is everything else outside of the butterfly shape. Okay. And we have the anterior column, posterior, and lateral column. So fortunately, these are mostly directional terms, nothing too anatomically complex here. And here's what it looks like all put together. The butterfly shape of the spinal cord is the gray matter. Okay. And just know that there's subdivisions of the gray matter: central, anterior, posterior. Okay. Central, anterior, I believe. No, posterior. Central, posterior, anterior. Okay. So we have the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay. And then everything else is the white matter. Okay. And the white matter has dorsal, ventral, and lateral. Okay. And then there you go. Spinal cord. Simple enough. Okay. And then finally, we, just like afferent versus efferent, the spinal cord has its own type of afferent versus efferent. Okay. We have an ascending track and a descending track. Ascending is our sensory input. Okay. And descending is our motor output. So kind of exact opposite of afferent versus efferent, right? Ascending is going to carry some sensory input up to our higher brain centers, and then whatever the effect is, it's going to travel back down our descending motor tract, and then we'll have the desired outcome. Okay. And this is where we get a lot of our big reflexes from. Here is everything put together. All of this slide is saying is ascending versus descending. Okay. This shows you the path of where do we get our input. What was the sensory information? It's going to travel up the spinal cord all the way up to our thalamus, or our transition center. And then there's going to be motor output, which will then travel down a descending tract, traveling away from the brain. And then we'll have some type of skeletal muscle contraction or some type of motor unit output. Okay. All right. That is the nervous system. Please email me if you have any questions.